Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com where you can find in-depth reporting and other resources concerning every topic you'll hear discussed on the podcast. While few people go straight from jail to a celebratory press conference, that's what happened to two pregnant jailed women just before Mother's Day when they were bailed out of the Bexar County Adult Detention Center. Both had spent about 2 weeks in jail when they finally stepped outside and joined the press conference organized by Texas Organizing Project as part of National Black Mamas Bail Out Day. To discuss how all that took place, I'm joined now for the first time by San Antonio Express News staff, editorial writer, and columnist Josh Brodesky. So Josh, great to have you here on the program. Let's begin with more background on these two women. Who are they and what first brought them to the Bexar County Jail?
Yeah, they are Simone Oliver and Shamika Prince, and they were brought to Bexar County Jail because they had been charged with misdemeanors. One, Shamika Prince had some prior arrests for nonviolent misdemeanors. And then for Simone, it was her first time being arrested. So there's a push right now for bail reform that is, changing the cash bail system to make it more accessible for people to be released if they have committed or if they've been accused of nonviolent offenses. So I think National Black Mamas Bailout Day was a way to sort of drive attention to that issue. And because these women were both pregnant, it was they are fairly sympathetic figures as we talk about people who are sitting in jail for nonviolent offenses, or at least who have been accused of nonviolent offenses.
And so obviously these two women, they got out of jail for this National Black Mamas Bailout Day. There was quite an affair. We'll talk all about that here in a moment. But Josh, I'm interested, obviously, when you are pregnant or if you have some sort of medical condition, you might be viewed a little bit differently in many different situations than, your average man or woman. But specifically in jail, I'm wondering, how are these people treated, or are they treated differently at all? If someone is pregnant or not pregnant in Bexar County Jail, is there any difference in how they're handled?
Well, that's a good question. It's something that did come up a bit at the press conference. It's not a point that I particularly explored in the column so much. I was more interested in how they hadn't seen their attorneys. But at the time, Bexar County Sheriff Javier Salazar talked about, inmates cost the jail roughly $40 to $60 a day. So that's just a rough cost. But obviously, if you are pregnant, and in this case, one was 3 months pregnant, one was 6 months pregnant, you may very well need additional medical attention. So the cost could be much higher. As to whether or not they received that additional medical attention, it's not something that came up in my interviews with them, but certainly as they get closer to their pregnancies, as they reach certain needed checkups, all those things would have to occur at the jail.
And then, let's get to the point that you just mentioned in your story titled 2 Weeks in Jail Without Seeing an Attorney, currently available at expressnews.com. You write that something was missing from this big event, a big to-do. You wrote about it. I remember reporting this on our Express briefing back when it happened. And it was the two pregnant women's lawyers. In fact, not only were they not there, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe neither woman had actually met their lawyer in person up to that point. So why was that the case, and why weren't the lawyers at this big event?
Right. The lawyers weren't there, and that's largely because they had not been in touch with their clients. These two women, they're indigent, which means that their counsel is appointed. These are private attorneys who are in a system called the wheel system, and they're sort of randomly selected to represent indigent defendants. It's not a system that pays particularly well. Roughly for a misdemeanor, an attorney is usually going to be paid $140 for basically however they represent the client. In this case, the women never really heard from their attorneys. They said they never met their attorneys. One of the attorneys confirmed that. The other one I wasn't able to get in touch with, but it didn't appear that they had ever had any contact with their attorneys over the 2 weeks in jail. The system is sort of set up in a way that there's not a lot of incentive for attorneys to meet with their clients until there's a court hearing set. And oftentimes at those hearings, because people have been in jail for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month or however long it takes to actually get to that court date, many people just actually plead out. They take a guilty plea to get out of jail. And obviously, there are consequences to that decision. You have a record. Things can compound on yourself. It could be harder to get a job. But somebody who is not in jail might be more inclined to go to court, to actually have a trial or to resist a plea agreement. So it sort of reflects a certain inherent inequality in the justice system. But the fact is that when I spoke to one of the attorneys, he was sort of surprised I was speaking to him about this because it's just sort of standard practice, I think, among many indigent defense attorneys.
So you're referring to standard practice for being about 2 weeks without seeing your client who may or may not be in jail.
Right. The attorney that I spoke with, he said, relatively speaking, 2 weeks is not a long time to spend in jail, which I think I understood his point that, in the system where thousands of people are kind of revolving through on misdemeanors or felonies and spending time in jail, and this is just one client or one defendant among numerous others. I can see that perspective, but at the same time, it does matter if you're the person in jail. And I think that I've spoken to, since that column, I've heard from a number of attorneys in the legal community, and many attorneys I spoke with said that someone who retained a counsel, someone who could pay for their own attorney would never have spent 2 weeks in jail. The first step that any kind of retained attorney would have taken would have been to file a writ to have the bail reduced and therefore get their client released. The idea that someone would sit in jail for 2 weeks on misdemeanor charges sort of appalled a number of attorneys that I heard from.
And so you mentioned this briefly, but I kind of want to go back to this topic because it's very interesting to me. So it turns out public defenders in Bexar County, they're required to meet with their clients. But obviously, I guess the point would be that there's not a timeline associated with that because at this big event, not only were the lawyers not there, they had not actually met with their clients. So could you talk a little bit about, is that some sort of a little bit of wiggle room or some sort of like catch-22 that's built into the system, that there's not maybe a date or timeline associated with this rule that you have to meet with your clients?
Well, there is a rule where indigent defense attorneys must notify their clients of representation within either, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's either within 48 or 72 hours. But they're supposed to notify their clients that, hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm your representative, please contact me, at the earliest convenience, so on and so forth. And that sounds great, but that doesn't necessarily translate. It certainly doesn't translate into an in-person meeting. And it usually, what it turns into, a common practice is simply to send a fax to the jail. So an attorney would send a fax to the jail, and that fax would say, I'm your attorney, and if you have any questions, contact me. But in reality, whether that fax ever gets to the client is a whole different kind of question, right? And so in this case, I think it's pretty clear that whatever communication was sent, it never made it to the two women. More kind of a better practice would be to send a letter to the jail, to actually send a postmarked letter that is going to reach your client, and then make sure that the clients know that they can call you collect to start talking about their case. But that rarely happens, and I think one of the reasons why that rarely happens is because the pay for representing indigents is incredibly low in Bexar County. Like I said, it's basically $140 flat fee for a misdemeanor, which for the amount of time it takes to truly represent a client doesn't turn into a great hourly wage.
Yeah, of course. I think anyone could understand how $140, especially for someone who spent, so many years and so much money going through law school, $140 might not be a lot for someone who does manual labor. I mean, that just seems extremely low. So I completely understand your point there. Let's look at a little bit different point that we haven't gotten to specifically yet. So these two women, how did they find themselves specifically involved with the Texas Organizing Project as part of this National Black Mamas Bailout Day? Obviously, they're, mothers, or they're going to be mothers. They were pregnant, so they probably fit the bill for what they were looking for. But are you aware of how that connection was made with these two specific women to be bailed out on this day and have this giant press conference?
Well, I think Texas Organizing Project was looking for a very specific type of defendant to showcase in terms of the issue of bail reform. In this case, the women are African American, and National Black Mamas Bailout Day. So they were pregnant, or they are pregnant, depending on which one you want to talk about. So they are also mothers. So they fit those requirements. Beyond this, you had one who had committed a first-time offense. It's an assault charge, but it was an assault charge related to a domestic dispute. So a little bit, I guess, different than maybe, a different type of assault charge. And then the other one was a nonviolent offense, sort of related to theft and fraudulent use of documents. So in that sense, because they were they sort of fit the bill, I think those are the defendants that TOP was looking for, and they received help sort of finding these women from Bexar County Sheriff Javier Salazar and other folks in the legal community.
Yeah, it's great that you brought up the county sheriff, because this was apparently quite the affair. He was in attendance as well as a lot of other people. Tell me about the actual event.
Yeah, so the press conference was it was at the steps outside the jail. And obviously Texas Organizing Project was there, and there were a number of community activists. But also in attendance, was Bexar County Sheriff Javier Salazar, who talked about the issue of jail overcrowding. Last year the jail set records in terms of its overall population. He said that this year the jail's on pace to set another record. And again, it gets back to cost. We have people in jail that cost taxpayers $40 to $60 a day. And when they're there for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, a lot of times that cost exceeds what, their bond might be to not be in jail. So, for example, in this case, one of the women, she had a $3,000 bond, and another woman Shamika had a $4,300 bond for two different charges. So, at 10%, the bond would be $300 and $430. So the idea, that's how much money it would take to kind of get them out. And instead they were there for 2 weeks at $50 a day. So we spent more keeping them in jail than they would have paid to get out. So it becomes a big issue financially. But there was another point that the sheriff made that I thought was very good. It just didn't quite fit into the context of my column, which is that he had sort of made the argument that jail isn't a place, it's not a place to punish people. These are people who are, they have the right of a presumption of innocence until they're proven guilty. It's not a place to put people if we're angry at them because of what they might have done. It's a place to detain people while they're going through their due process. And in that sense, if you're talking about people who aren't accused of any kind of violent offense, it stands to reason that they'd be better served, and we'd be better served having them back in the community where they can be at work and participate and possibly even enter into some type of rehabilitation. So other people who were there, we also had, there was Joe Gonzalez, who's a Democrat running for district attorney, who's fairly open to reforms. It'll be interesting to see if he is elected district attorney, how those reforms sort of play out from a prosecution side. And then also the Michael Young, who's the chief Bexar County public defender. It's a fairly small office, but the public defender's office represents some indigent clients, almost exclusively tied to indigents who have mental health issues.
And then specifically what you mentioned about what the sheriff was saying, personally, that all sounded great to me. And I think a lot of other people might have a similar feeling as what I just described. But it just sounds so odd, almost like a conflict of interest. The person who's, involved in law enforcement has, a management, elected role in the area is sort of, in a way, anti-establishment and anti, the offices that he or she works for. And I think that the points that you made that the sheriff said were perfectly legitimate, but to me, it does sound like a very precarious situation to be. How did the Bexar County sheriff navigate that role? Because obviously he would want to represent the people he works with and the people that he, respects and believes in. But at the same time, he was sort of poo-pooing the system that he represents.
Right. I think he's just reflecting an honest, I think the sheriff doesn't really have any say over the bails that are set, but the sheriff does oversee the jail. And so in that sense, he can speak to the cost of incarceration, right? And the sort of the consequences of holding people in jail who are accused of in this case, basically nonviolent misdemeanors. I think the balance that the sheriff and numerous others have to strike is sort of recognizing that that you would not want to be the person who released somebody who then went on to commit or be accused of a violent crime, right? So it's the devil's always in the details in terms of a broader policy and ensuring that people accused of nonviolent crimes are released, but the caution is who wants to be the judge or the sheriff who advocates for someone who then to be released, who then goes on to commit murder or some kind of other brutal act of violence. As far as being kind of anti-establishment, I don't know. I didn't perceive the sheriff to be anti-establishment or anything like that. I think he was just speaking honestly about the costs of the system. That some of it on its face seems sort of nonsensical. This idea that that we would pay so much to hold people in a way that can have some pretty severe consequences in their lives. That's not to say that if they're found guilty or they if they really did commit the crime that they're accused of, that they shouldn't suffer consequences. But at this point, remember they've only been accused of something. And that's a principle that we should all hold on to.
And that's a great segue to my final question. Do you have any update on either of the women that we're talking about today?
The one woman I've been sort of following, Shamika, she was 6 months pregnant and she lost her baby. She had a miscarriage the day after she was released. So, at this point, I've been talking to Texas Organizing Project about how she's doing. It's not really clear right now how stable she is, but she lost the baby, and there's certainly a lot of grief tied to that. So we'll see. With Simone, she had said that she had lost her job at a call center. I'm not so sure if she's been able to find work again, but I do plan to follow up with both women as a little bit of time passes from their release.
Wow, Josh, that's really sad to hear. Is there any connection? Is anyone talking about any connection between the incarceration and the loss of that child?
No, I mean, I think it's hard to, I don't think anyone should jump to conclusions about that. I mean, certainly we should all be aware that incarceration would be highly stressful. That said, if you're talking about people in indigent situations, you could even argue that maybe there's better medical care when someone's incarcerated than, say, kind of living in an indigent situation, sort of on the street or moving from home to home. So I don't think any of us should jump to any conclusions that because someone was in jail that therefore she lost her baby. But I do think, I think it's probably safe to say that, being incarcerated while pregnant is not ideal. And, but I haven't heard anybody say because of X, we've had Y, It's just a sad situation, though.
Yeah, no, excellent point to bring up. Definitely a sad situation, but of course, not wanting to jump to conclusions. Well, Josh, we're about to wrap things up. I do want to give you one moment to, give final thoughts either on anything that we've already covered or something that hasn't come up in the conversation yet today.
I guess just one other point would be that with the question of how quickly a defense attorney should contact their client, I do think that lack of contact does play a role in this issue of cash bond and people sitting in jail for bonds that they can't afford, because an earlier contact would give the attorney some sense of the situation. They'd more quickly review the case and see the merits of the case. And the fact that many attorneys don't meet with their clients until a court hearing only sets up this kind of situation where people take plea agreements that might not necessarily be in their best interest. So we'll see how it unfolds. I plan to write more about this issue throughout the course of the year.
Oh, well, maybe we'll have you here on In-Depth again over the course of the year as you write more on this issue, as you just mentioned. So Josh Brodesky, great to speak with you, and thank you for sharing your information today.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Chance.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News staff, editorial writer, and columnist Josh Brodesky for joining me for today's episode of In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Storland.